If in-ring wrestling is the music we listen to as fans, then commentary is what provides the lyrics. And arguably, no one in the history of the business has ever been better at this than Jim Ross. Yes, while there have been many greats of the past and present, like Gordon Solie, Bobby Heenan, or Mauro Ranallo, it's pretty safe to say that no one single announcer has achieved as much behind the booth as good old JR, with him providing some of the most iconic calls in wrestling history, all while giving a real sports-like feel to the often pantomimesque proceedings. But how did he get to this level of greatness? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey so far in Good Old JR, The Jim Ross Story. James William Ross was born on January 3, 1953 in Fort Bragg, California, but would move to Westville, Oklahoma at a young age. And it was there that he would find an early passion for sports as a member of both his high school baseball team and football team. But that wasn't to say it was all athletics for the youngster, as he would also do well academically while studying at Westville High, being at points a member of the National Honor Society, the president of the student body, and state vice president for the Future Farmers of America. In fact, so highly regarded was he by the FFA that in 1970 they would award him a state degree, after which James would successfully run to be the vice president of the entire Northeast District. That said, farming was never going to be a career he would fall into for long, as by then he had already fallen in love with the world of pro wrestling. And while he didn't want to step in the ring himself exactly, the broadcasting experience he'd picked up while at college was enough to see him get an in with the local NWA tri-state territory as an announcer. As well as that though, Jim would also do some work as a referee here, carrying out dual roles up until the point that Bill Watts purchased the territory in 1977 and decided to rebrand it as Mid-South Wrestling. And upon realizing how much savvy the Oklahoman had for the backstage side of the business then, Watts would promote him to the roles of both lead play-by-play announcer and vice president of marketing. Yes, it was a big step up in his burgeoning career, and so, wanting to prove he was worthy of the position, Jim immediately set to work on trying to put on the best performance he could every night, something he was able to show when, soon after this, he got to call his first NWA World Heavyweight title match featuring Ric Flair and Ted DiBiase. After that, the commentator would get an offer of a job with Jim Crockett Promotions, with him jumping ship then and providing color commentary alongside David Crockett and Tony Schiavone, a role he would continue to keep up as JCP later morphed into World Championship Wrestling. And of course, for most men, having a full-time job as a wrestling announcer, as well as the many backstage hats he was beginning to carry, would be enough. Not for Jim Ross though, because in 1992, right as his career was reaching new heights with WCW, he would spend a season working as a radio announcer for the Atlanta Falcons. But that wasn't a particularly hard transition for him to make because, as a sports aficionado, he'd always called wrestling as such, giving any match he was there for a sense of legitimacy that few others could match. And with him continuing to work his way up the corporate ladder while he was doing this, Jim would soon find himself in the position of head of broadcasting at WCW, a role which often saw him butt heads with the company's newest commentator and future executive vice president Eric Bischoff. That was why, despite having a solid position in the company, when Bischoff got the top job in 1993, Ross would request his release, feeling then that the heat between the two men would surely stifle his progression going forward. So, needing to find new work quickly, especially as around this time Ric Flair had introduced him to Jan, the woman he would later marry, Jim took a buyout from his Turner Broadcasting contract and went right over to WWE to start a new chapter of his career. And making his inauspicious debut there at April 4th, 1993's WrestleMania 9, he would be introduced to this new audience while wearing a toga, something which was in keeping with the Roman theme of that particular show. Still, silly outfit or not, Ross did get to do what he did best that night, calling the matches as they came and proving to fans that he was just as good as Bobby Heenan, who he was sharing the booth with. And while he would soon be taken off the commentary desk for pay-per-views, with Vince McMahon at this point believing that his accent was too southern, Jim would continue to work alongside Heenan on Wrestling Challenge up until the point that his announce partner would leave the company in December of that year. So, looking for something new to do then, the Oklahoman would suggest the idea of Radio WWE to his boss, a broadcast that would call the action of WWE pay-per-views for those who didn't have a chance to see it themselves. Unfortunately, though, this never really took off, and so by February of 1994, Ross would be fired from the company for the first time, a mere 2 weeks after he'd suffered his first bout of Bell's palsy, a condition that causes temporary paralysis on one side of the face. But refusing to let this keep him down, he would jump over to Smoky Mountain Wrestling, where he would work for a while, supplementing this by returning to his radio announcer duties with the Atlanta Falcons. And when Vince McMahon was indicted by the US government as part of the steroid trial in 1994 and was no longer able to continue on as a commentator for Raw, he would call JR up and asked him to return to the fold, something which the announcer did for the next few months, teaming up with Randy Savage on the booth up until the point that Vince was acquitted. At that point, however, JR would find himself fired for a second time after he'd allegedly been caught leaking information to wrestling journalists such as Dave Meltzer. But luckily this wouldn't stick for long, and after another brief tour of SMW, Jim would return to WWE in 1994, though this time largely being relegated to working on syndicated WWE programming, a position he would stay in over the next 2 years. Yes, it wasn't until 1996 that he would return to the main announce team alongside Vince McMahon and Jerry the King Lawler. And around that point, he would actually become more of an on-screen character too, as he would infamously turn heel, getting into heated segments with the Boss that saw the Oklahoman claim to still be in contact with Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, two former WWE superstars who had recently jumped to WCW. And after spending weeks telling everyone that he was about to bring them back into the fold under his management then, something he was apparently doing so as to get revenge on McMahon for firing him in the past, JR would reveal the new and improved version of the duo on the September 23rd episode of Raw. Of course, as soon as they came out to the ring though, it immediately became clear to fans that this wasn't the Hall and Nash that they remembered. No, this was two entirely different wrestlers trying to portray their gimmicks of Diesel and Razor Ramon. Yes, feeling that as he owned the IPs and could simply recast the gimmicks if he wanted, the Boss had tried to pull a fast one on fans. But fans were having none of it, of course, and as the on-screen agent behind this storyline, Ross took the brunt of their boos going forward. Thankfully then, the fake Diesel and Razor storyline wouldn't last long, and by the end of the year, the two copycats, played by Glenn Jacobs and Rick Bogner respectively, would largely have been dropped from TV after management recognized how quickly the whole thing was failing. So, trying to recover from this, Ross would return to the commentary desk as he became not only the play-by-play announcer for Raw, but also for Shotgun Saturday Night, Superstars, and Action Zone too. And how lucky this was then, as it was right at the point the company was beginning to explode in popularity, something which was largely down to Stone Cold Steve Austin, the anti-hero everyman who had captured the hearts of fans everywhere and who Jim himself would form a close friendship with in real life. And this would often show itself on screen as Ross became something of a cheerleader for the Rattlesnake during this period, delivering now iconic calls such as, "He's stomping a mud hole and walking it dry," "He's tougher than a $2 steak," and the ever-popular, "Stone Cold! Stone Cold! Stone Cold!" But that wasn't to say it was just Austin who got the benefit of Ross's shine, because everyone on the roster was happy to have him calling their matches as, alongside his broadcast partner Jerry Lawler, he provided the soundtrack to some of the most memorable moments of the 90s and early 2000s. Moments such as his hilarious delivery of "Aw, son of a bitch" when Vince McMahon was revealed as the mysterious higher power in 1999, his call of "Climb the ladder, kid, make yourself famous," as Jeff Hardy was on the verge of winning the undisputed title from The Undertaker in 2002, and of course, his commentary work during the Deadman and Mick Foley's Hell in a Cell match in 1998, where some of his most memorable quotes included, "By God, they've killed him! As God is my witness, he is broken in half, and will somebody stop the damn match?" Sadly though, this period wouldn't be all positives for JR, as, for a period at the end of 1998 and leading into 1999, he would have to leave the commentary booth temporarily when he suffered a second bout of Bell's palsy following the death of his mother. When he finally did return to work after that in March of 1999, he would have a new enforcer by his side, that being Dr. Death Steve Williams, a figure who'd long been feared in the wrestling world for his legitimate tough guy credentials. And so, hoping to manage Williams' career path going forward, Ross had convinced McMahon to position him as a potential next top challenger to Steve Austin, something which seemed to be progressing just fine up until Vince Russo created the Brawl for All, one of the worst ideas in wrestling history, which saw a group of competitors, Dr. Death included, take part in a series of shoot fights on TV. But despite hoping that their newest signing would win this, Williams would end up getting legitimately knocked out by Bart Gunn in the second round, with this pretty much killing his aura as a monster dead and causing any plans for him to get a run with Austin to be nixed. So after that, JR would settle back into his old role of primarily being an announcer, working on both Raw, SmackDown, and even in regional broadcasts of Vince McMahon's short-lived XFL in 2001. As well as this, Ross would occasionally hit the ring himself, usually alongside his real-life best friend Steve Austin, as part of whatever angle the Rattlesnake was involved in that month. And further using his notoriety as the voice of the Attitude Era, Jim would branch out from there when he got the role of Lance Russell, a wrestling announcer in the Andy Kaufman biopic Man on the Moon around this time. On top of that, he would also release 2 WWE-themed cookbooks, Can You Take the Heat?, The WWE is Cooking, and JR's Cookbook, as well as releasing a range of his own barbecue sauces too. But for all his forays into movies, football, literature, or food, it would be wrestling where his main focus continued to lie, and by the time the Attitude Era was drawing to a close in 2001, Ross was already being considered by many to be the greatest wrestling commentator of all time. And this was a reputation he would continue to keep up heading into the Ruthless Aggression Era, even if, by this point, it was clear that McMahon was looking to replace him, still feeling that his southern accent made him sound too wrastlin' for his tastes. So as Michael Cole gradually became the voice of WWE TV, JR would begin to segue back into corporate backstage duties as he became the executive vice president of talent relations around this time, an often thankless role that saw him have to deal with the issues of all the performers on the roster and bear the brunt of their frustrations. So thankless was the job, in fact, that come 2005, Ross would have stepped down from the role. And not long after that, he would be kayfabe fired from the company again when Linda McMahon sent him packing, this time on the October 10th, 2005 edition of Raw. The reason for this, as it turned out, was because he was taking time off to undergo colon surgery, something which WWE would host segments making fun of in the weeks that followed. Yes, Vince McMahon would carry out a number of examples of antagonism against his top announcer over the years, and for Ross's part, he would try his best to ignore it and get on with his job, a job which by this point mainly saw him balance producing commentators from backstage while also returning to the booth for shows like Raw, Saturday Night's Main Event, and occasional pay-per-views such as WrestleMania 22. So, to thank him for all his years of service to the industry then, in 2007, he would be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame by none other than Steve Austin himself. After that, he would open up his own restaurant, JR's Family Barbecue, in his home state of Oklahoma. All while back on TV, he would be drafted over to SmackDown in 2008, something which Ross himself was not happy about and didn't know was coming ahead of time. And come October of 2009, things would get worse as, after suffering a third bout of Bell's palsy, he would be removed from his role as a regular TV commentator altogether, with him from there only making the occasional guest appearance behind the booth for shows such as Old School Raw in November 2010 and WrestleMania 27 in April 2011, the latter of which he'd been specifically requested for by Triple H and The Undertaker as they were having their end-of-an-era match on that very show. By 2012, improvement would come though as, with Triple H having then taken over the job of head of talent relations, he would hire JR to work as an advisor and scout within his department going forward, sending him out from there to scour the indies and the colleges for the best up-and-coming talent that could become future WWE superstars. As well as this, in 2013, Jim would add to his many hats when he started coaching and producing new announcers who were learning the craft at the WWE Performance Center, imparting his decades of wisdom onto these recruits there in the hopes that they one day may be able to fill his large shoes. Of course, that wasn't to say he'd been gone from TV altogether by then, because when Jerry Lawler suffered a heart attack around this time, Ross would fill in for him as a commentator during his absence. On top of that, he'd return once more in January of 2013 as well to call the steel cage match between John Cena and Dolph Ziggler. Sadly though, this would be one of his last appearances as, at a panel set up to announce the roster of the then upcoming WWE 2K14 video game soon after, he would get into trouble when he allowed Ric Flair to start telling drunken stories about the death of his son. That said, when you see the actual footage, it's clear that it wasn't JR's fault, and there was no way he would have been able to regain control of the situation even if he tried. And it wasn't exactly as if 2K seemed upset about the whole incident either. Still, Vince McMahon would fire Ross once again following the incident, with many believing that he had just been looking for an excuse to do so, as he felt the Oklahoman was getting a little too long in the tooth by then. And if true, what a silly decision this was, as not only being arguably the greatest commentator of all time, but one of the most savvy men backstage too, JR still had a wealth of value to provide to any company. And so, with WWE's doors being closed, he took these skills over to the world of other sports next, calling a boxing event for Golden Boy Promotions in May of 2014, a Battlegrounds MMA show alongside Chael Sonnen in October of the same year, and taking up a role as a contributor for FoxSports.com's coverage of NCAA football on top of all that. As well as this, he would enter the burgeoning wrestling podcast world when, around this same time, he teamed up with the don of wrestling podcasts himself, Conrad Thompson, to create the Ross Report, with this later being renamed Grilling JR and following much the same format as Thompson's other shows with the likes of Bruce Pritchard, Eric Bischoff, and Tony Schiavone. But even with all the success he was finding, the in-ring wrestling world wasn't ready to let him go just yet. And so, in January of 2015, the Oklahoma boy would make his New Japan Pro Wrestling debut when he acted as one of their English-language commentators for that year's Wrestle Kingdom show. A couple of weeks after this, and it was announced that Ross had signed a contract with the company to announce their weekly Access TV show in America going forward, with this allowing him to put on some great work again, as his legitimacy perfectly fit in with the more sports-style presentation of NJPW. And while he wasn't doing this, he would be providing commentary for the likes of What Culture Pro Wrestling and World of Sports Wrestling in the UK too, working the former alongside his old friend and colleague, Jim Cornette. Come March of 2017, however, tragedy would strike, as Jim's wife Jan would be involved in a head-on car accident, with her immediately being put on life support as a result of this and dying 2 days later. And obviously this was a devastating moment for JR, losing the love of his life so abruptly. So wanting to help him through this hard time, the wrestling industry rallied around him, with both fans and industry insiders offering support and well wishes in the days that followed. But for Ross, the best way to deal with his grief was to throw himself back into his work. And recognizing he needed this, WWE would bring him back to act as play-by-play announcer for the main event of WrestleMania 33 the following month, with this one seeing The Undertaker take on Roman Reigns in what, at the time, many felt would be the dead man's retirement match. After that, it was announced that Jim had signed a new 2-year deal with the company from there, as he would periodically return to the booth for things such as the Mae Young Classic, Raw 25, and WrestleMania 34. Once his contract ran out in March of 2019, though, JR would choose not to re-sign, believing then that he still had it in him to be a full-time announcer, and that by staying with WWE, he would be missing out on the opportunity to do so. Thankfully then, there was another company starting around this point who would agree with him, and that would be All Elite Wrestling. Yes, in April of 2019, the upstart promotion announced that they had signed Ross to a 3-year contract to act as part of their commentary team, where he would now be working alongside Excalibur and his old colleague Tony Schiavone. And there, Ross has managed to find a second lease on life and introduce himself to a whole new generation all over again. Sure, some have criticized him for not being as sharp as he once was, and for the most part, he now tends to take a step back and let Excalibur handle play-by-play, but the fact remains that he's right about still having a lot to offer as, for any lapsed fans tuning into TBS on a Wednesday night, the familiar sound of his voice alone could be enough to draw them in. And it looks like he's going to remain in that position for the foreseeable future as, after recently going through a health scare that saw him have to undergo radiotherapy so as to treat skin cancer, he's been given the all clear again, with this allowing him to return to doing what he does best. Yes, when it comes down to it, Jim Ross probably is the greatest wrestling commentator of all time, as the facts remain that, while Gordon Solie was fantastic, he never had the iconic calls that JR did. And while Bobby Heenan is a legend, even he can't quite match up to the work that everyone's favorite Oklahoman has given us over the years. He has the ability to make average matches feel good matches feel great, and when he gets the chance to call a great match, he makes it sound like an instant classic every time, telling a story unlike any other, one that weaves you into the narrative of about as if you were right there with him. And that's a role that should never be underestimated as, at the end of the day, without him, the wrestling world might never have had the lyrics it needed when it needed them the most. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.